Chapter 18 of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. A visitor from India. When French reached Victoria, the first person he saw on the platform was Maxwell Cheyne. "They told me at the yard that you might be on this train," the young man said excitedly as he elbowed his way forward. "Any news? Anything about Miss Merrill?" He looked old and worn, and it was evident that his anxiety was telling on him. In his eagerness, he could scarcely wait for the inspector to dismount from his carriage, and his loud tones were attracting curious looks from the bystanders.
"Get a taxi," French answered quietly. "We can talk there."
A few seconds later, they found a vehicle, and Cheyne, gripping the other by the arm, went on earnestly. "Tell me, I can see you have learned something. Is she all right?"
"I got news of her on Thursday last. She was all right then, though still under the influence of a drug. The whole party has gone to sea."
"To sea?"
"Yes, to sea in a small tramp. I don't know what they are up to, but there's no reason to suppose that Miss Merrill is otherwise than well. Probably they took her with them to prevent her giving them away. They would drug her to get her to go along, but would cease it as soon as she was on board. I wired for inquiries to be made at the different signal stations, and news may be waiting for us at the yard."
A few seconds sufficed to put Cheyne in possession of the salient facts which French had learned, and the latter, in his turn, asked for news. "By Jove, yes," Cheyne cried. "There is news. You remember that Arnold Price had disappeared? Well, yesterday I had a letter from him."
"You don't say so,"
French rejoined in surprise.
"Where did he write from?"
"Bombay. He was shortly leaving for home. He expects to be here in about a month."
"And what about his disappearance?"
"He was ill in hospital. He'd gone up to Agra on some private business and met with an accident, was knocked down in the street and was insensible for ages. He couldn't say who he was, and the hospital people in Agra couldn't find out, and he hadn't told the Bombay people where he was going to spend his leave."
"Did he mention the letter?"
"Yes. He thanked me for taking charge of it and said that when he reached home, he would relieve me of further trouble about it. He little knows."
"That's so,"
French assented. Their taxi had been held up by a block at the end of Westminster Bridge, but now the mass cleared, and in a few seconds they reached the yard. French's first care was to get rid of Cheyne. He repeated what he had learned about Joan Merrill. Then, assuring him that the key of the matter lay in the cipher, he advised him to go home and try it once more. Directly any more news came in, he would let him know. Cheyne having reluctantly taken his departure, French made inquiries as to what had been done in reference to his telephone from Antwerp. It appeared that the yard had not been idle. In the first place, an application had been made to the Moroccan government, who had replied that no ship had been chartered by them for freight at Casablanca, nor was anything known of agricultural samples for the Italian market. Lowenthal's story must therefore have been an absolute fabrication. He had, however, told it so readily that French suspected it had been made up beforehand, so as to be ready to serve up to any inquisitive policeman or detective who might come along. Next, Lloyd's had been approached as to the direction the Lescaut had taken, and a reply had shortly before come in from them. It stated that up to noon on that day, the vessel had not been reported from any of their stations, but this, French realized, might not mean so much. If she had gone south down the English Channel, it would have been well on to dark before she reached the Straits of Dover. In any case, had she wished to slip through unseen, she had only to keep out to the middle of the passage, when, in ordinary weather, she would have been invisible from either coast. On the other hand, had she gone north, she would almost naturally have kept out of sight of land. It was true that in either case, she would have been likely to pass some other vessel which would have spoken her, and the fact that no news of such recognition had come to hand seemed to indicate that she was taking some unusual course out of the track of regular shipping. French wired this information to the Antwerp police, and then, his chief being disengaged, went in and gave him a detailed account of his adventures in Belgium. Chief Inspector Mitchell was impressed by the story. He sat back in his chair and treated French to a prolonged stare as the latter talked. At the end of the recital, he remained sitting motionless for some moments, whistling gently below his breath. "Any theories?" he said at last. French shook his head.
"Well, no, sir,"
he answered slowly.
"It's not easy to see what they're after, and it's not easy to see either why the whole gang wanted to go. It looked at first as if they were just clearing out because of Cheyne's coming to the yard, but it's more than that. The arrangements were made too long ago. They have been dealing with that Antwerp firm for several weeks."
"The hard copper was all a story?"
"Looks like it, sir. As a matter of fact, every single statement those men made that could be tested has been proved false. Even when there didn't seem any great object in a yarn, they pitched it. Lies seemed to come easier to them."
"Well, I've known a few good cases of that, and so have you, French. It's a habit that grows. Now, what's your next move?" French hesitated.
"For the moment, the outlook's not very cheery," he said at last. "All the same, I can't believe that boat can go away out of the Scheldt and disappear. In my judgment, she's bound to be reported before long, and I'm looking forward to getting word of her within the next day or so. Then I have no doubt that the tracing is some kind of cipher, and if we could read it, we should probably get light on the whole affair."
"Why shouldn't you read it? Try it again."
"I intend to, sir, but I don't hope for much result, because I don't believe we've got the genuine document. I don't believe they would have handed it, nor a copy of it either, to a man they intended to murder, lest it should be found on his body. I'd state long odds they gave him a fake."
"I think you're probably right," the chief admitted. "Try at all events. You never know your luck." He bent over his desk, and French, realizing that the interview had come to an end, quietly left the room. Then, seeing there was nothing requiring his attention urgently, and tired after his journey, he went home. But contrary to his expectations, the next day passed without any news of the Lescaut, and the next, and many days after that, nor could all his efforts with the tracing throw any light on that mysterious document. As time passed, he began to grow more and more despondent, and the fear that he was going to make a mess of the case grew steadily stronger. In vain he laid his difficulties before his wife. For once that final source of inspiration failed him. Mrs. French did not take even one illuminating notion. When the third week had gone by, something akin to despair seized upon the inspector. The only possibility of hope now seemed to lie in the return of Arnold Price, and French began counting the days until his arrival. One night, about 3 weeks after his return from Belgium, he settled down with a cigar after dinner, his thoughts running in their familiar groove. What were these people engaged on? Was there any way in which he could find out? Had he overlooked any evidence or any inquiries? Had he neglected any possible line of research? The more he considered the affair in all its bearings, the more conscious he became of the soundness of the advice he had given to Cheyne, and which in his turn he had received from his chief. Unquestionably in the tracing lay the solution he required, and once again he racked his brains to see if he could not by any means devise a way to read its message. On this point he concentrated, going over and over again everything he had learned about it. For perhaps an hour he remained motionless in his chair, while the smoke from his cigar curled up and slowly dissolved into the blue haze with which the room was becoming obscured. And then, suddenly, he sat up and with a dawning, tremulous eagerness considered an idea which had just leaped into his mind. He had suddenly remembered a statement made by Cheyne when he was giving his first rather incoherent account of his adventures. The young man said that it had been arranged between himself and Joan Merrill that if either were lucky enough to get the tracing into his or her possession, the first thing he or she would do would be to photograph it. Now, in juxtaposition with that statement, French recalled the facts. First, that Joan must have reached her flat on the night of her abduction at least several minutes before Blessington and Syme arrived with their car. And secondly, that during those minutes she had the tracing with her, the genuine tracing, as there was every reason to believe. Had Joan photographed it? French was overwhelmed with amazement and chagrin at his failure to think of this point before. Nor could he acquit Cheyne of a like astounding stupidity. For himself, he felt there was no excuse whatever. He had even specially noticed the girl's camera and the flashlight apparatus which she used for her architectural details when he was searching her rooms, but he had then, and since then up till this moment, entirely and completely forgotten the arrangement made between the partners. Late as it was, French decided to go then and there to ascertain the point. The key of Joan's flat was at the yard, and 20 minutes later he had obtained it and was in a taxi bowling towards Horn Terrace. He kept the vehicle while he ran up the 10 flights to number 12 and secured the camera. Then, hastening down, he was driven back to the yard. By a piece of good luck, he found a photographer who had been delayed by other important work, and him he pressed into the service forthwith. With some grumbling, the man returned to his dark room, French, too eager to await his report, accompanying him. A few moments sufficed to settle the question. The camera contained a roll of films, of which the first 7 had been exposed, and a short immersion in the developer showed that numbers 5, 6, and 7 bore the hoped-for impress. Gone was French's despondency and the weariness caused by his heavy day, and instead he was once more the embodiment of enthusiasm and cheery optimism. He had it now. At last, the secret was within his grasp. Of his ability to read the message, now that he was sure he had the genuine one, he had no doubt. He had always liked working out ciphers, and since he had succeeded in extracting the hidden meaning from the stock and share lists which had been sent to the elusive Mrs. X in the Gething murder case, his belief in his own powers had become almost an obsession. He could hardly restrain his eagerness to get to grips with this new problem until the negative should be dry and prints made. The photographer was able to promise these for the following day. Until then, French had to possess his soul in patience. But on his return from lunch, he found on his desk 3 excellent prints of the document. They were only half-plate size, or about 1/3 that of the tracing which had been given to Cheyne. He therefore instructed the photographer to prepare enlargements which would bring the document up to more nearly the size of the original. These were ready before it was time for him to leave for home, and he sat down with ill-controlled excitement to compare them with the document at which he had already spent so much time. And then he suddenly experienced one of the most bitter disappointments of his life. To all intents and purposes, the two were the same. There were the same circles, the same numbers, letters, and signs enclosed therein, the same phrase, "England expects every man to do his duty," spaced round in the same way. The tracing had not been very accurately done, as some of the circles seemed slightly out of place, but the discrepancies were trifling and seemed obviously due to careless copying. He gave vent to a single bitter oath, then sat motionless, wrapped in the most profound gloom. He took tracing and photographs home with him, and spent the greater part of the evening making a minute comparison between the two. The enlargement, unfortunately, was not exactly the same size as the tracing, and he therefore began his work by covering the surfaces of both with proportionate squares. Taking the tracing first, he drew parallel lines 1 inch apart, both up and down it and across, thus covering its whole surface with inch squares. Then he divided the prints into the same number of equal parts, both vertically and horizontally, and ruled them up in squares also. These squares were slightly smaller than the others, about 7/8 of an inch only, but relatively the lines fell on each in the same positions. A comparison according to the squares thus showed at a glance similarity or otherwise between the two documents. As he examined them in detail, certain interesting facts began to emerge. The general appearance, the words, "England expects every man to do his duty," and the circles with their attendant letters and numbers were identical on both sheets, but there were striking variations. The position of certain of the circles was different. Those containing numbers and crooked lines were all slightly out of place, while those containing letters remained unmoved. Moreover, the little crooked lines, while preserving a rough resemblance to the originals, were altered in shape. The more he considered the matter, the more evident it became to French that these divergences were intentional. The tracing which had been given to Cheyne was intended to resemble the other superficially, and did so resemble it, but it had clearly been faked to make it valueless. If French were right so far, and he had but little doubt of it, it followed that the essential feature of the circles and crooked lines was position. This, he felt, should be a useful hint, but as yet he could not see where it led. He pondered fruitlessly over the problem till the small hours, and next morning he took the documents back to the yard to continue his studies. But he did not have an opportunity to do so. Other work was waiting for him. To his delight, he found that Arnold Price had reached home, and that he and Cheyne were waiting to see him. Price proved to be a lanky and rather despondent-looking individual, with a skin burned to the color of copper, and a pair of exceedingly shrewd blue eyes. He dropped into the chair French indicated, and instantly pulled out and lit a well-blackened cutty pipe.
"Got in yesterday morning," he announced laconically, "and wired Torquay I was going down. By the merest luck I got a reply before I started that Cheyne was in town. I looked him up, and here I am."
French smiled pleasantly. Though interested in the man, he could not help noting with some amusement at once the restraint and the completeness of his statement. How refreshing, he thought, and how rare, to meet someone who will give you the pith of a story without frills.
"I'm glad to meet you, Mr. Price," he said cordially. "I suppose Mr. Cheyne has told you the effect that your letter has had on us all?"
The other nodded.
"Not altogether surprising," he declared. "There's money in the thing, or so I always believed, and this other crowd must believe it too, though how they got on to the affair licks me." "We shall be very interested to hear what you can tell us about it," French prompted. "Will you smoke, Mr. Cheyne?"
He held out his cigar case.
"I can't tell you much," Price returned, "and nothing that will clear up this blessed mystery that seems to have started up. But this is my story for what it's worth. Before the war I was on one of the Hudson and Spence boats, and I had the luck to get into the R&R when hostilities broke out. I stayed on in my old ship till she was torpedoed a couple of years later. Then I was appointed third officer on the Morania. We were on a trip from South Africa to Brest with army stores, when one day, just as we came into the English Channel, we were attacked by a U-boat. We had an 18-pounder forward, and by a stroke of luck we gave old Fritz one on the knob that did him in. The boat went down, and a dozen of the crew were left swimming. We put out a boat and picked one or two of them up. The skipper was clinging onto a life belt, but just as he came up, he let go and began to sink. I was in charge of the boat, and some fool notion came over me. I think in the hurry I forgot he was a U-boat skipper. But anyhow, like a fool, I got overboard and got hold of him. It was nothing like a dramatic rescue. There was no danger to me, and we were back on board inside 15 minutes.
French and Cheyne were listening intently to this familiar story. So far it was almost word for word that told by Dangle. Apparently, then, there was at least one point on which the latter had told the truth.
"We weren't out of trouble," Price resumed, "and next day we came up against another submarine. We exchanged a few shots, and then a British destroyer came up and drove him off. But I had the luck to stop a splinter of shell, and when we got to Brest I was sent to hospital. The U-boat skipper had got a crack on the head when his boat went down, and he was sent in too. By a chance, we got side-by-side beds in the same ward and used to talk a bit, though he was a rotter, even for a Boche.
Price paused to draw on his cuddy pipe, expelling great clouds of smoke of a peculiarly acrid and penetrating quality. Then, the others not speaking, he went on.
It turned out that the wound on Schultz's head, his name was Schultz, was serious, and he grew steadily worse. Then one night when the ward was quiet, he woke me and said he knew his number was up and that he had a secret to tell me. We listened, but all the other fellows seemed asleep, and then he told me he could put me in the way of a fortune, that he had hoped to get it himself after the war, but now that it would be a job for someone else. He said he would tell me the whole thing, and that I might make what I could out of it, if only I would pledge myself to give 1/8 of what I got to his wife. He gave me the address, somewhere in Breslau. He asked me to swear this, and I did, and then he took a packet from under his pillow and handed it to me. There, he said, the whole thing's there. I put it in cipher for safety, but I'll tell you how to read it. Well, he began to do so, but just then a sister came in, and he shut up till she would leave. But the excitement of talking about the thing must have been too much for him. He got a weak turn and never spoke again.
But, Cheyne interposed, what about the hard copper? Dangle told us about Schultz's discovery. Price gazed at him vacantly for some moments, and then suddenly smote the table.
I've got it, he cried with an oath. Dangle, I remember that chap now. He was in the next bed on the other side of Schultz. That's right. I couldn't call him to mind when you mentioned him before. Of course, he heard the whole tale, and that's what started him on this do.
I know, Cheyne returned. He admitted that all right, but he told us about the hard copper. You haven't mentioned that. Price shook his head.
Don't know what you're talking about, he declared. What do you mean by hard copper?
Dangle mentioned it. He was listening to the conversation. He told us all that about Schultz's story of the fortune and about his wife and all that, just as you have. But he said Schultz went on to explain what the fortune was, that he had hit on a way of treating copper that made it as hard as steel. The cipher contained the formula. Again, Price shook his head.
All spoof, he observed. Not a word of truth in it. Schultz never mentioned copper or said anything more than I've told you.
French spoke for the first time.
We found this Dangle a man of imagination all through, and it is easy to see why he invented that particular yarn. By that time he had undoubtedly read the cipher and wanted something to mislead Mr. Cheyne as to its contents. The story of the hard copper would start a bias in Mr. Cheyne's mind, which would tend to keep him off the real scent.
He paused, but his companions, not speaking, continued.
Now we have that bias cleared away. At least one interesting fact emerges. The whole business starts with the sea, the U-boat commander Schultz, and it looks as if it was going to end up with the sea, the tramp, the Lescaut.
As French said these words, an idea flashed into his mind, and he went on deliberately, but with growing excitement.
And when we connect the idea of a U-boat commander giving a message which ends with a sea expedition, with the fact which I have just discovered, that the essence of his cipher is the position of the markings on it, we seem to be getting somewhere.
Price smote his thigh.
By Jemima, he cried, I've got you. That blessed tracing is a map. A map, yes. That's what I think,
French answered eagerly. And then, as suddenly he saw the possible significance of Nelson's exhortation, he went on dramatically.
A map of England.
Cheyne swore softly. My word, if we aren't a set of blithering idiots, he exclaimed. Of course. England is the title. That's as clear as day. The other words are added as a blind. Let's have the thing out, Inspector, and see if we can't make something of it now. As French produced his enlarged photographs, not one of the three men doubted that they were at last well on the way towards wresting the secret from the document which had so long baffled them. End of chapter 18.